Good evening. I'm Marty Owings, and we're here at the State Office Building, and I'm with Representative Erin Murphy, who represents District 64A in St. Paul. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on towards the end of session. So, as I understand it, the Republicans have proposed a plan that doesn't spend any, doesn't raise a lot of taxes, but it pulls from the general fund, which seems to be out of band from traditional ways we fund roads, bridges, things like that. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts there.
So I think there were three very clear budgetary priorities for this legislative session, in addition to some issues that are important to the legislature and to the administration. So I think clearly Minnesotans understood on our way into the session we wanted to tackle transportation. There was a tax bill left behind last session that people were hoping would be advanced this year, and then in the second year of the biennium, we usually tackle infrastructure, the bonding bill. And
this is a bonding year.
It is. Well, you know, we bond in even and odd years, but it is the year that we traditionally do the bonding bill. I am surprised that we are just 4 days from the end of this legislative session, and we haven't resolved the differences that we face around how we fund a transportation bill. Mm-hmm. And as we have been working on this issue this session, the Republicans continue to move the goalpost, and they continue to look to the governor and to us as the reasons why we can't get a transportation bill passed, but they keep backing away from ideas to actually fund a comprehensive solution. I was surprised this week that they agreed to license tab fees as a funding source. It is an idea that came from the administration to replace the gas tax, because the Republicans have continued to say that they're very opposed to that. And so in order to find funding, comprehensive funding that we can rely on into the future, the governor proposed license tab fees, and the Republicans put a second proposal on the table that includes that license tab fees, so a tax increase. Yeah. But it isn't sufficient to meet the governor's threshold in terms of amount. And now we're having a debate about whether or not we include transit, and especially light rail here in the core city. The Republicans are saying that that's a non-starter for them. I think most Minnesotans understand if we're going to do comprehensive transportation, we need to think about roads and bridges and transit statewide. Okay. So here we are, 4 days away from the end of the session, and we are pretty far apart in terms of resolving the idea of transportation.
Sure. Well, question for you about the governor's proposals. How does the caucus feel about that, and the DFL leadership in the House and Senate?
You know, I can't speak for the Senate, but in the House and the DFL caucus, we are very committed to getting something done on transportation, and we have said all along that we have an open mind about how we resolve that. We would not be really strong advocates for taking a lot of the surplus one-time funding to support a comprehensive transportation package, although we understand that some money from that surplus might be a part of the solution. We're also reticent to use the bonding bill, the capital investment bill, to fund transportation significantly, because it displaces then the things we need to do for higher education and for housing. So we have consistently said for us, what will be important is that we support something that's comprehensive and statewide and is funded into the future.
Well, okay, more in terms of what the governor is proposing in terms of a license tab increase or tax versus what the Democrats might want in terms of revenue. Were they in sync with this? I mean, were you in agreement with the governor's proposal, or is this just something the governor is doing to try to get a deal done?
You know, I think that there has been a lot of private conversation around the idea of transportation. I will tell you that Scott Dibble from the Senate and Representative Kelly, the chair of transportation in the House, have been working for a year to come up with ideas that would resolve our transportation funding. Yeah. And out of those discussions came this idea of license tab fees as an idea to get around the impasse. It was a new idea for a lot of members of our caucus, and we haven't really been able to take it up in terms of considering it in a bill yet. So We haven't talked it all the way through, but I do know that we are really committed to try and getting something done.
Yeah, and okay, so in terms of, this has crossed sort of a boundary that hasn't been crossed before when you're taking general fund money to do things that bonding would ordinarily do, is that correct? I mean, that's what Alice Hausman was telling us not too many weeks ago.
You know, our chair when we were in the majority, Alice Hausman, has a lot of experience in bonding, and she knows those rules inside and out.
Yeah.
And she's an advocate always for a statewide infrastructure bill that tends to our infrastructure. That's the way that we maintain sewer and water, our
We talk
college
about
campuses,
transportation too here,
et cetera.
that's in there, right?
And sometimes there are, the trunk highway funds, there are
Right.
things that we have done at times in transportation, a big bridge project like we want to do in St. Paul. But we don't rely on bonding traditionally to replace the work that we should be doing on a transportation funding bill.
Okay.
And that's what she's worried about.
Right, and so I guess that ship has sort of sailed, right? I mean, that's what it's gonna come down to. I mean, does the governor sign a bill like that, even though he knows that many in your caucus don't agree with that necessarily?
I couldn't speak for the governor on
Yeah.
what he won't sign.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, he hasn't said publicly then, I guess, right? Yeah, okay. So, 4 days left. What's left to do?
Well, I think the things that we came in to accomplish this session are still undone. Transportation, taxes, and an infrastructure bill. They moved a bonding bill today. We've been waiting to see a bill, and they did produce one today. They moved it through committee. They're going to use a rules procedure to get it onto the floor tomorrow, which is, good. And we'll have a debate about that. The Senate's already taken a vote on a bonding bill. The Senate Democrats proposed a pretty significant sized bonding bill. The Republicans in the Senate modified that to try and make it a little smaller, so about $900 million. And both the amendment and that bonding bill failed in the Senate. So, here we are at the end of the session. We haven't voted on a bonding bill in the House. There isn't a bonding bill active right now in the Senate, although I'm sure they can produce one. 4 days out, we haven't done anything with broadband. One thing that is really important to me that is not really getting a lot of attention is the funding for St. Peter and for Anoka, the Metro Regional Treatment Center.
Yeah.
We know that they're having a tremendous time adequately staffing those facilities. And there was a lot of work done in the interim to bring forth a proposal to make sure that there was adequate staffing and facility upgrades in those two facilities. I have been to both. I visited both St. Peter and Anoka. They are caring for people with significant mental illness and some that are coming from correctional facilities. And both patients and staff are unsafe in the situation they are facing right now. And we continue to hear stories about people being injured at work, both patients and the staff there. And we need to infuse that situation with some reliable funding so they can turn the corner and get some adequate staffing in there to protect the interests of both the workers and for the people in their care. And it's not getting much attention, but it is near the top of my list of things that needs to get done this session in the supplemental budget bill. The other thing that we have talked about all session long and last summer and fall was broadband, and making sure there's adequate broadband funding. That's another issue in the supplemental budget bill that is in a conference committee right now, moving very slowly. And lastly, I'll say there's been a lot of attention paid to racial and economic disparities. The governor has asked for $100 million in funding for that. We feel very strongly in the House Democrats, that we need to tend to that issue, and we have really put pressure on Speaker Dowd. He has not paid much attention to our demands that we provide funding for rectifying racial and economic disparities. We had a meeting yesterday with Neighborhoods Organizing for Change and others who are very much interested in making sure this agenda is advanced this session, and that should also be tackled in the supplemental budget bill, still in conference now.
So that's what hasn't been done. Tell me about what has been done since March up here.
Well, I think the governor signed a number of bills into law in the last week or so. So we've passed a number of small bills. We've debated twice this week whether or not hunters can wear blaze pink instead of blaze orange. I'm not sure why we debated it twice. So we are, I will share, I'm obviously expressing some frustration in that there are some significant issues that we came into this session to accomplish. They are still waiting, and we're spending time on the floor debating things that, while may be important to a constituency, are not critical to the future of the state of Minnesota. And that, for me, is just a real miscarriage of our work.
Okay. And so you've got some support on the Republican side for your broadband, especially from rural Republicans who we've interviewed during this session, who've said they're really pushing for that access out for theirs because they need it in the rural areas for the students and stuff. So you think with that bipartisan support, you could get something moving here in the last few days?
I sure hope so. I think there is, strong bipartisan support in both caucuses, and it's not regionally oriented. I understand, just like my colleagues in Greater Minnesota understand that it's going to be important that people have access to reliable broadband, and it's important for students and for people that are working in hospitals and for businesses. So that case has been made. I think Minnesotans understand it. And the infusions of money that we've put into broadband in the last couple of cycles has been snapped right up in a competitive bidding process. So the demand is there as well. What I'm worried about is, because we're just in these last 4 days and there's so much left to do, that important measures like that get left behind because we can't come to a conclusion and we haven't given ourselves enough time to really negotiate that stuff out.
Yeah, and there hasn't been much movement on it, Representative Murphy, but in the past we've talked about sort of the closed door end of session negotiations that are very not transparent to the public, and the public's angry about that. I mean, at least they've expressed concern about it. Any movement there at all on trying to add some transparency to that process in your mind?
I think that the public, the electorate, are frustrated with a lot of things. A lot of large institutions, corporations, governments, et cetera. You can feel it, right?
Yeah.
And
the lack of transparency.
Yeah, it's transparency, but it's also just the sense that the things that are important to Minnesotans, the priorities that are important to Minnesotans, are not necessarily being tended to. So if I don't expect that we're going to see any change in how we conduct our work.
Not the end of this session.
Right, and in fact, I think we've backed ourselves right back into a corner like we did last session when the Republicans, sent a bill to the floor with just a minute left of the legislative session. So we got the bill. We didn't have a chance to read it. We were asked to vote for it. That was the last thing that happened at the end of the last session.
Yeah, right.
We could see something like that happen again only because we haven't given ourselves, or the majority hasn't given us enough time to really get our work done. If we come back in the majority, the Democrats, we are really interested in taking the next step in terms of reform of our rules and the processes here. We did a lot of that work back in 2013 to inject transparency, especially into the floor debate with our rules and amendments. But I think it's going to be time. It's going to be really important for us not only to think about our own conduct, so to make sure that we're giving ourselves enough time between when a bill passes, when we can take it up and debate it,
Yes.
before its final passage, before we send it to the governor, which is where things are getting jammed up.
Yeah.
But also that we think about transparency and disclosure in our elections,
Sure.
so that we are protecting the integrity of our elections and our democracy.
Right. Okay. We're visiting with Representative Erin Murphy. She's the Assistant Minority Leader here in the House of Representatives for the DFL. And a couple more topics before we wrap up today, Erin. One of the things that has come up is body cameras, and you guys passed a bill off the floor, and I think it was quite controversial. It got a lot of people into the committee hearings. Black Lives Matters was here. Nakimi Levy-Pounds, I believe, was here to speak against the bill that was passed ultimately. Can you tell me a little bit about what your frustrations were in the bill and how that may affect the public trust in the police going forward?
Yeah,
Maybe I framed that question too.
No, that's okay. That's okay. The legislation that we took up on, I think it was Monday night, is, it's a complex piece of legislation because we are talking about, in some manner or form, the relationship between law enforcement and the citizens of the state. And there have been things happening across the country that have, I think, undermined the trust between law enforcement and the citizens in some places of
Right here,
Evanston,
Jamar
right?
Clark, and
Exactly.
yeah.
And the good of where we are in time, from my perspective, is out of the shooting of Jamar Clark and the protests that happened afterwards. There has been a fair amount of attention paid to a number of issues that aren't always on the agenda here at the legislature, and one of those is about policing and law enforcement and the use of body cameras. It's an issue that has been bubbling here for some time at the legislature, but there's been, a shift in the urgency around that issue. We have to balance, obviously, the needs of the public, their right to know, their interest and transparency, the issue of privacy for people who may be subject of a tape, and then our desire to make sure that policing is happening in a way that follows the rules, right? And that's a tricky balance when you're trying to legislate it. I was impressed with the debate that we held on the issue. There were a number of amendments that came forward. I think we only adopted one of those amendments. And in the end, I didn't vote for the bill because I was concerned that not enough of the public's voice had been heard as it moved its way through this legislative session. I understand it's going to go to conference. I hope that they're able to strengthen the bill and balance, the needs of law enforcement and the public. I think striking that balance is going to be important. I will also tell you that I heard from the law enforcement here in St. Paul, who shared with me that they believe they have been working very hard outside of this legislative process to reach out and build a stronger sense of community and trust with the law enforcement here in St. Paul and the people in St. Paul, and they believe they're making progress. I hope that's right. Because it is, me as a nurse, right? You have to have the faith of the people in your care, and I think citizens have to have faith or a sense of trust, or at least a sense that the police have their best interests in mind.
Yeah, I mean, the chief of police in St. Paul, Tom Smith, is well known for being in the community and out there and trying to build those bridges. And he retired last night, and I heard him speak, and he said, the time to build a community is not during a time of crisis. The groundwork has to be laid. And I don't think of St. Paul as one of the issues with the public trust, but I think of other communities, and even right close in Minneapolis. And doesn't it come down to police accountability? And really, the bottom line is they want to hold themselves accountable. And I think citizens are concerned about that. So often we see that not occurring. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Well, I know that in America, we live in a society that relies on checks and balances, right?
Right.
And I think any institution or profession that has power needs a check on it.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is simply the public's ability to know or find out and understand what is happening, especially when we're talking about the loss of life or grave bodily harm.
Right.
I think in those situations, we want to make sure that citizens, that people have an ability to understand what happens, while also making sure that we are looking out for the safety and integrity of our law enforcement officers, right? Because they do serve in the line. They have an important and risky job. And if we can get to that place where there is a sense of trust and balance, that'll be better for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think finally I'll just ask you, we've been asking legislators this session, because people hear so much about the conflict and controversy at the state capitol, because I think that's what plays in the popular media. But we've been asking them to pick a colleague in the House or Senate that they admire on the other side of the political aisle, and just talk about them for a second or two and say what you like about that person. Would that be something you'd be willing to do? Okay, kind of put you on the spot there,
No, it's okay.
but I know you have people that you get along with well. And so, who comes to mind when you think about somebody in the House or Senate that you respect or work well with?
Well, there are a number of people, House and Senate, across the aisle that I like and enjoy their company. And there are people that I know that I can go to and work with and trust. So I will name a few.
Okay.
I have had, for many of my years here, a really good working relationship with Representative Matt Dean. We've done a lot of work together in healthcare. He's the chair right now of Health and Human Services. We don't always agree. We often disagree. And this is a place where we have to, at the same time as we disagree, find that way to get along, right?
Right. Oh,
And
get
it
things
is,
done.
yeah,
too.
right. Well, not only to get
Yeah.
things done, but there's it took me a little while to get the hang of this, right? But
It takes everybody a while.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
This is a place that is built on our ability to respectfully disagree with one another.
Right.
That we bring our disagreements to the table and then find our way to reach a conclusion.
Mhm.
I am finding more and more that we're struggling with not airing our disagreements. We're good at that. But then getting past those disagreements to a solution. That's where we're struggling. I'm finding more of the reach of politics into our ability to legislate and govern. I'm really worried about this as we see more independent money coming into the politics of Minnesota,
Yeah.
both in our elections and in between. We got through a really tough 2014 race where we had seen record amount of spending in some of the targeted House races.
Yeah.
For instance, in St. Cloud, they spent nearly $1 million in that race when all calculated together. It's an unheard of number in a legislative race. And right after the election, and we were sworn into office, and we started seeing mail
Mhm.
being sent in to House districts from outside groups criticizing current members, right?
Sure.
So the extension of the election continues. And as that happens, it divides us further.
Yeah.
So there's been some discussion about moving the primary forward here in Minnesota from August to June, which would mean we would be actively campaigning for election while we're in session,
Yeah.
because early voting has
Yeah.
already started. I'm worried about that and its reach into
Yeah.
our ability to govern while here without being concerned about the election at home. So to your question, Matt Dean, I get along with Matt very well. I have
Yeah.
really enjoyed working with Tony Albright. He and I worked on regenerative medicine together, and we made great progress and
Yeah.
got something funded. And last I'll say, and I'm going to miss her, I have done a lot of constructive work with Representative Tara Mack from Apple
Yeah,
Valley.
sure.
She's retiring. She is bright. She is a problem solver. She's good on her word. And those are the things, right? Despite our disagreements,
Your
those are the
character.
hallmarks
Yeah, right.
of our ability to get along together.
Yeah.
And I look for legislators, Democrat and Republican, who bring
Yeah.
those traits to this work.
Good. Well, I think that almost wraps it up. I would say there's a big election, there's a big election going on this year with president. Have you decided who you're going to support in the election? Is it Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders? Have you decided yet?
Yep.
Or Donald Trump?
I'm not supporting Donald Trump.
Okay, fair enough.
I met Hillary Clinton years and years ago when I was working for the nurses, and she was working on healthcare, and so was I. And I actually ended up doing what they call advance campaign work for
Okay.
President Clinton and then First Lady Hillary Clinton.
Sure.
So I had a chance to get to know her and work with her some on healthcare, and so I'm supporting her. But I will tell you, I love the energy and the agenda that has come together for the Democrats because of the campaign between Secretary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, Senator
Yeah.
Sanders. I think that has been good for us. And I hope, right, that everybody who's engaged in this part of the race stays engaged, because together, two things. One, I think it's going to be important that we defeat in Minnesota the presumptive nominee, Donald Trump. And I think it's going to be important that we continue to work together to build a brighter future for people who work for a living here in
Yes.
Minnesota.
Mhm.
That's part of my agenda. I know that's part of Hillary Clinton's agenda, and I want to help to get her elected.
All right. Thank you,
You're
Representative
welcome.
Murphy. Appreciate your time tonight. And this has been Capital Conversations. I'm Marty Owings. Well, I won't be live by the time you see this, but we're at the State Office Building with Representative Erin Murphy. Thanks for joining us.